In today's video, I'd like to talk about one of the biggest sound changes that happened as medieval Spanish was evolving into modern Spanish, and that is the sound shifts that happened in the sibilant consonants. Now, medieval Spanish and medieval Portuguese are more or less the same in the way that they spell and pronounce these sibilant sounds, but we can see as they evolve into their modern forms that the way that they both pronounce and choose how to spell these sibilant sounds changes. Sibilant sounds are sounds that are made by directing air at a high velocity towards the teeth with the tongue. And in languages, when I have sounds like s, z, sh, zh, those sounds are sibilant sounds. So in medieval Spanish and Portuguese, we have a wide array of sibilant sounds. So those sounds in medieval Spanish and Portuguese, first we have a s sound. That s sound is spelled either with an s at the beginning of a syllable or a double s between two vowels. A singular s between two vowels is pronounced as a z. And we can see that convention occurring in French as well, where a double s between two vowels is pronounced as s, and a singular s is pronounced as z, right? If I have a word like chasser, and then if I have a word like maison, then that's two s's and one s, and they're pronounced as sa and za. We can also see this happening in Italian, but really only in the southern region, where a single s between two vowels in the south is pronounced as z, like if I have a word like casa. But then if I have a word like that in northern Italian, it is pronounced as a s, no matter where it is, they say casa. There is a ts sound in medieval Spanish and medieval Portuguese. And that s sound is spelled with a c before a or e, and a c with a cedilla before a, o, or u, which we can still see that spelling in modern Portuguese, but not in modern Spanish. You see it in old Spanish texts, but not in modern Spanish. And it should be said that oftentimes when I look at words in Portuguese, the words in Portuguese appear to me to look a little bit older than they do in Spanish, because modern Portuguese has not changed the spelling of these sibilant sounds to such a high degree as Spanish has. We also have a z sound. This z sound is spelled with the letter z. We have a sh sound. The sh sound is spelled with an x. And we have a j sound or a zh sound. Those sounds merged quite early in the evolution of the sibilant sounds. And that's spelled with a j before o, a, u, or it's spelled with a G before A or E. And we also have a ch sound, and this ch sound was written with a C and an H. So those are the sounds that we have in medieval Portuguese and medieval Spanish, and we're going to see that they evolve differently when they diverge into the separate languages. So I'd like to talk about how Portuguese simplified the sibilants first, and their version of simplifying the sibilants was a little bit simpler than Spanish. We can see with these sibilant sounds that have affricates in them, affricate consonants, like ts, which is a combination of t plus sa, or z, which is a combination of d plus z, or ch, which is a combination of t plus sh. In Portuguese, they simplify those sounds by getting rid of the affricate sounds and making them into fricative sounds. So for example, the ts becomes simplified into s. The z becomes simplified into z. The j becomes simplified into zh. And the ch becomes simplified into sh. So all those sounds that were previously affricate sounds, they became fricative sounds. What happened in Spanish is not much more complicated, but it is a little bit more roundabout. We do see in Spanish the de-affrication happening, where this z becomes z, ts becomes sa. But then we also have another step, which is de-voicing. Now, voicing means that vocal cords are vibrating when we pronounce a sound. For example, if I say va or b, those are voiced sounds. And if I say f or p, those are unvoiced sounds. So in Spanish, these sibilant sounds, they lose their voicing. So that means that z becomes s, zh becomes sh, and that caused a very large merger between those sounds now, so that we lost affrication and we also lost voicing. Now something even further happened in Spanish, and that is the differentiation between this sh sound, which later became a ch sound. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the novel Don Quixote. In Old Spanish, it's spelled with an X, and in Old Spanish, it would be pronounced as Don Quixote, which is not so different from how it's pronounced in Portuguese and French. But that sh sound actually became a h sound. And the reason why that happens is because it's a kind of differentiation, and we can see this sh sound. If you drag the tongue back further and further, it does shift into a h sound eventually. Now, the last part is something that is, we can see a very strong difference between this based on the countries in which Spanish is spoken. We can see a C and a Z before A and E pronounced as a th in Spain, in most parts of Spain, and we can see C and Z pronounced as s in Latin America. Why that is because the sound shift I'm about to talk about, it happened after Spain had already founded its colonies in the New World, and most of the people that populated those new colonies were from southern Spain, where this innovation hadn't happened yet, and still in a lot of regions in the south, it does not happen. So from the original s sound and the original ts sound, when they became de-affricated and devoiced, we were left with two S sounds that were similar but not the same. We had one that was s with the tongue towards the front of the mouth, and we had one that was s with the tongue towards the back of the mouth. The blade of the tongue is in a different position between these two sounds. The one where the tongue is farther forward in the mouth, this s sound, the tongue actually started to become so dragged forward that it actually shifted over time into a th sound. And I think probably a reason why that happened was to make a distinction between those two s sounds, since as you can hear a difference between a s and a s, it's really not so strong, even for me. So the reason why that happened is to differentiate between those two sounds. And again, we don't see that happening in Latin America, because that innovation had not happened, and the people that populated Latin America were mostly from the south, and they didn't bring that language convention with them. It should be said, though, that Portuguese, particularly European Portuguese, does have an innovation which is not present in Spanish or in a lot of regions of Brazil, and that's that S sounds or Z sounds are pronounced as sh or j, depending on the consonant that follows them. For example, if I were to say the word student in Spanish, I would say estudiante. If I said it in Brazilian Portuguese, I would say estudante. And then if I said it in Portuguese from Portugal, I would say estudante. So we can see that that sh sound exists in Portugal, European Portuguese, but not in most regions of Brazil and not in Spanish. We can look at another example if we have an expression like my parents. In Spanish, I would say mis padres. In Brazilian Portuguese, in most regions, I would say os meus pais. And then in Portugal and in those regions where they do that innovation in Brazil, I would say os meus pais. So we can see how this sh sound really comes in pretty distinctly. And I would say that's one huge difference when you listen to Brazilian Portuguese and European Portuguese, that you can hear the difference between those two sounds. So let's take a look at some words that have these sibilant sounds in Spanish and Portuguese, and let's see how they compare in modern Portuguese. For example, if I take a word in Spanish like I pass, I would say yo paso. In Portuguese, I would say eu passo. So the s sound is the same, but we can see that it's spelled differently than in Portuguese. It has two s's because one s leads to a z sound in Portuguese. If we look at a word like rose, the flower, in Spanish I have rosa, and then in Portuguese I have rosa. So we can see how the single S, it differs between those two languages. With a word like sky, in Spanish I have cielo, and then in Portuguese I have céu. So those again, they are both s sounds, and one's spelled with a s. But if I have a verb like to hunt, in Spanish I would say caçar or cazar, depending on whether I'm from Latin America or Spain. And then in Portuguese I say caçar, and that has the the C with the cedilla. If I wanted to say a word like short, in Spanish that would be bajo, and then in Portuguese I would have baixo.
because remember that sh sound shifted into a ch sound in Spanish.
If I want to say a word in Spanish and Portuguese like a game, in Spanish I would say un juego, and then in Portuguese I say un jogo. So we can see again the ch and the j sound, where they're both spelled with j's, but they're pronounced differently. And then if I have a word like chorizo, the food, in Spanish I have chorizo or chorizo, depending on whether I'm from Latin America or Spain. And then in Portuguese I have chorizo, chorizo. So it's a show sound in Portuguese, where it's a ch sound in Spanish. Both spelled with ch. So I would say the sibilants are definitely some sounds that are pretty different in Spanish compared to other Romance languages. They're even different from Portuguese pretty greatly, as we can see in the video we just did. And really I think that Spanish is the only language where we have a J sound that's realized as a ch, or a G, soft G sound also that's realized as a ch. We don't see that in the other Romance languages so much, where G's and J's are pronounced as zhs for the most part. So I hope you enjoyed this video about historical Spanish, and if you want to see more videos just like this one, subscribe to my channel, Mappa Mundi Languages, to see new videos out every Friday.